Speaking as a film critic, you know what bugs me more than bad movies? Bad movie criticism. Seriously, is there anything worse than watching someone else suck at something you know how to do? Like, remember when you were a kid and you'd see someone play a video game that you knew like the back of your hand, but they were terrible at it, and your mind is just going, no, the weak spot is right there, guy, just shoot at it, dumbass? Well, that's how I feel when I read and or watch movie reviews from people who have no business being in this business. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be a jerk and call anybody out here, but just for one example, how often have you seen a film critic automatically mark down a movie for being formulaic, i.e. adhering too close to a familiar storytelling template? I've been guilty of applying this one too broadly myself on occasion. The thing is, finding entirely new ways to play out a sequence of events isn't the only goal of every story. Sometimes the reason to tell a story is to observe the behavior of a character or group of characters, or to explore a new kind of world that the author has conjured, and in those cases using a proven, established formula is a good way to take care of the structural detail so the author, filmmaker, whatever can concentrate on those concerns instead. To use the most relevant recent example, The Avengers followed a very familiar, well-worn guys teaming up for a job formula. Act 1, meet some guys. Act 2, tension because the guys don't all get along. Act 3, guys rally to common cause and get the job done. The bad guys are even just the bad guys because the movie isn't about unraveling some maze-like mystery of a plot. It's about seeing what happens when these very different characters interact with one another. Marking down the story here for being formulaic is like criticizing the Super Bowl for not being played on a more interesting breed of grass. Who cares about the grass? Watch the game. This works for video games, too. Pretty much every Mega Man game had the same basic story and the exact same structure, right? And with those aspects taken care of, the designers had time to concentrate on memorable character design, imaginative art direction, ingenious level layouts, and genre-defining musical compositions. All the stuff that makes the Mega Man series hold up so damn well. Now, you know what one of the best examples ever of this phenomenon is? I love the Flintstones. Fred Flintstone is one of the greatest fictional characters ever devised in any medium, because he can fill a broad range of story positions without ever feeling out of character. Sometimes he's a great dude, sometimes he's a real jerk, sometimes he's making mischief, sometimes he's the victim of mischief, but it always feels like the same guy. And what better sidekick could there be than the game for anything yet good at nothing Barney Rubble? And how interesting is it that in an era where gender equality had yet to manifest itself in many live-action TV households, Wilma and Betty were both as capable of solving problems and prone to causing them as their respective husbands. The Flintstones, to put it simply, rock. And part of the reason that they rock is that they were made up using sitcom writing formulas that were as ancient and rigid as every building material in the town of Bedrock. The main inspiration for the Flintstones was, of course, the pioneering TV comedy The Honeymooners, but it also adhered studiously to the conventions of pretty much every other family situation comedy that had followed Jackie Gleason's genre-defining landmark series. Well-meaning working-class oaf? Check. Nagging housewife? Check. Wacky best friend neighbor? Check. And most of the episodes followed similarly well-trod sitcom ground. Get-rich-quick schemes, mistaken identities, forgotten anniversaries or holidays, annoying in-laws, spiraling out-of-control white lies, slapstick home repairs, the whole shebang. The Flintstones defined formula television, and yet it was a massive success, staying on the air for 6 seasons, a record no primetime animated series would break until The Simpsons 3 decades later. And even after cancellation, the characters were so entrenched in the popular culture that they lived on through continuous TV revivals all the way into the 21st century, with movie and merchandising legs that continue even today. How? Well, good characters for one, pop culture immortality as the mascots of one of the most delicious cereals ever for another, but mainly they had a really strong joke to build on top of that formula foundation, reimagining the banal absurdity of mid-60s suburban American consumer culture in a fantasy version of the Stone Age. It seems like such a simple little joke. Take the appliances, automation, architecture, and other technical advancements that were then considered the cutting edge of comfortable ultramodern domesticity and figure out how they might work if they were made of rocks and animals. But it allowed for great creative visuals and was usually really funny. Plus, it offered a sly bit of subtle satire, implying whether intentionally or not that our pleasantly automated modern lives weren't really that far removed from primitive savagery, and none of this would have been possible without formula. So, remember the last time I did one of these about a Hanna-Barbera cartoon and the research turned up so many weird spin-offs that I got a whole other episode out of going through them? Well, that happened this time too. And that wasn't hyperbole back there. The Flintstones really did stay on TV in one form or another for nearly half a century. And next week, I'm going to show you just how weird it got for them. You see, while the original aim of the Flintstones was to make a cartoon that spoke to an adult or at least not specifically child audience, and while it was successful at that goal, the fact is kids wound up being the ones buying Flintstones branded merchandise and eventually became the series' most loyal first wave of fans. So when the show was cancelled in 1966 and the feature film spin-off, a James Bond parody titled The Man Called Flintstone, failed to draw big numbers at the box office, it was clear that if the Flintstones were going to survive, they would have to take their chances in a new world: Saturday morning children's programming. What happened when they got there? The original primetime version of the Flintstones went off the air in 1966, having fallen out of favor with the adult audiences it was first aimed at. This actually happened to a lot of the more family-friendly nighttime sitcoms amid the radical social realignment currently underway in the country around them, but unlike many other TV families, reruns of the Flintstones immediately found a new home: children's programming. So when it came time to bring the modern Stone Age family back for new adventures, retooling them for the world of Saturday morning cartoons was an obvious call. What was surprising, however, was that even though one of the benefits of animated characters had always been their immortal agelessness, Hanna-Barbera actually decided to move the Flintstones story forward in time. Running only one season from 1971 to 72, the Pebbles and Bam Bam show took place an undetermined number of years after the original series, with Pebbles and Bam Bam now grown up as high school sweethearts. It wasn't a bad show, but it lacked the sharper wit of the original and ultimately couldn't escape just being an Archie ripoff with a Flintstone branding. In 1973, Pebbles and Bam Bam were replaced by the Flintstone Comedy Hour, which combined the remaining Pebbles episodes with new comedy bits focused on Fred and Barney, and musical interludes where the teenage characters' band, the Bedrock Rockers, would perform some of that fake cartoon rock and roll Hanna-Barbera was notorious for using in the 70s. In 1974, they dropped Pebbles, Bam Bam, and the rest of the teenage characters from the lineup entirely and reran just the Fred and Barney material as the Flintstone Comedy Show. Then, in 1977, they chopped up those shows into thirds and ran them serialized, along with similarly re-edited versions of other short-lived projects like Goober and the Ghost Chasers and Partridge Family 2200 AD as Fred Flintstone and Friends, with Fred hosting and introducing each segment. Though their regular TV appearances would sadly remain in this netherworld of re-edited anthology hell for a good long while, 1977 also saw the characters begin what turned into a long-running series of TV specials, working the familiar heroes have to replace Santa Claus premise for a Flintstone Christmas. The following year brought the Flintstones' Little Big League, which featured a rare depiction of Pebbles and Bam Bam as preteens playing for rival Little League teams coached by their respective fathers. That same year, the timeline on the regular broadcast side tracked backwards even further, as 1978's The New Fred and Barney Show took the series back to basics, with even more sitcom-style stories and Pebbles and Bam Bam as babies once again. This revival only lasted 17 episodes, which, yes, really, were once again repackaged into another anthology show, in this case combined with episodes of a solo series featuring a teenaged version of Marvel Comics character The Thing. Really. The two shows never actually crossed over into one another, one set being reruns, but they called the series Fred and Barney Meet the Thing anyway, but only for the first 13 episodes, after which it was combined with a third new series, The New Shmoo, yet another Scooby-Doo knockoff, but with the Shmoo from Al Cap's 1940s Little Abner comic strip, and retitled it Fred and Barney Meet the Shmoo in 1979. Oh, you think that's confusing? The same year, there was a Halloween special called The Flintstones Meet Rockula and Frankenstone, but episodes of the new Fred and Barney show had also introduced a vampire named Rockula and a Flintstoneized version of the Munsters called the Frankenstones. And even though they had the same names and appearances, they apparently weren't supposed to be the same guys. And then in 1980, another version of the Frankenstones were the subject of The Flintstones' New Neighbors, part of a well-received limited-run revival of the show in primetime called The Flintstone Special. 1980 also saw a Saturday morning revival in the Flintstone Comedy Show, an anthology combining 6 new Bedrock-themed shows: the classic-style Flintstone Family Adventures, a Frankenstone solo series, Pebbles, Dino, and Bam Bam, in which the 70s Bedrock teen characters reunited for a Scooby-Doo ripoff, Dino and Cave Mouse, which in turn was a Tom and Jerry ripoff, Bedrock Cops, where Fred, Barney, and the Shmoo, yes, the Shmoo again, were part-time police officers, and Captain Caveman, a Bedrock-set prequel to the inexplicably long-lived earlier Hanna-Barbera series Captain Caveman and the Teen Angels. This series would later be, yes, again, re-edited into shorter segments to be re-syndicated as the Flintstone Funnies, which would end up being the last time the traditional version of the characters would be part of a new regular series for many years. The Flintstones celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1986, which Hanna-Barbera actually marked with an hour-long live-action retrospective special, and yet another overhaul for Saturday mornings, The Flintstone Kids, with child versions of Fred, Barney, Wilma, and Betty. People don't seem to remember this one very fondly, but it did last last until 1988, effectively ending with the requisite mid-80s anti-drug special Just Say No, which, I kid you not, featured Michael Jackstone doing a reworded anti-drug cover of Beat It. And that would pretty much be the end of the Flintstones universe in episodic TV. 1 year earlier, however, the grown-up versions of the characters made the transition to feature-length made-for-TV movies with the landmark crossover The Jetsons Meet the Flintstones. And even though it'd be a 7-year wait for the next one, TV movies would be where they'd live for the remainder of the 20th century. 1993 saw the now 20-something Pebbles and Bam Bam finally tie the knot in I Yabba Dabba Doo, then give birth to their own twin babies Chip and Roxy that same year in Holly Rockabye Baby. In 1994, this timeline continued into the short Christmas special A Flintstone Family Christmas, which confusingly occurred the same year as the non-consecutive full-length feature A Flintstone Christmas Carol, which wound up being the final new production to date to utilize the Flintstones and their traditional character models. 7 years later, in 2001, Hanna-Barbera, Cartoon Network, and producer Jendy Tartakovsky took a stab at bringing the franchise back to its more adult-targeted comedy roots with the TV movie The Flintstones on the Rocks, which mixed old-school sound effects with striking new character models, plus a short claymation sequence, an edgier sense of humor more reminiscent of The Simpsons, and a slightly darker-than-usual script focused on Fred and Wilma's attempts to salvage their increasingly deteriorating marriage. Some people hated the new take, others liked it, but it didn't ultimately lead to the hoped-for revival, and all such matters kinda faded into the ether when William Hanna sadly passed away that same year. To date, On the Rocks hasn't even had a DVD release. And apart from a bizarre cameo by Fred in a 2006 episode of The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, that was the last hurrah for Fred, Wilma, Barney, and Betty. But what might the future hold? Well, last year, Family Guy creator Seth MacFarlane announced that he'd be using his accumulated power at the Fox network to get a pair of his dream projects off the ground. The first being a revival of the late Carl Sagan's science documentary series Cosmos, hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and the second, currently postponed but apparently still happening, being a reboot of The Flintstones. I'm Bob, and I can't think of a rock pun here, and I really wanted one. Oh well.